Okay, welcome. Today I'd like to offer some reflections about the female perspective of boarding school. What is the difference? What are some of the things that girls and boys, what are the differences there? And I just want to talk a little bit about that. And also share about basically the podcast I'm doing next Monday about this subject, talking to some female ex-boarders and people who are working in this field. So, okay, so next week I'm speaking on my podcast to two ladies, Karen McMillan, who's an ex-boarder, and Sarah Warner, who is a counsellor. So both of them are counsellors, and they run workshops for women ex-boarders. And we connected a few months ago, and I invited them onto the podcast to speak about, the work they're doing with female ex-boarders and what the difference is. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. I've just been reading Joy Schaverie's book, and her chapter 3, she talks about, it's named All Girls Together. She talks a bit about the history of boarding schools for girls, how it came about and how they are different. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit today. So basically, the first thing really for girls was the boarding school was designed for boys. That's really important to know. It was designed for boys first of all, but it was adopted for girls. What that meant was essentially they were in the same environment, but there were some simple things which were different. So for me, I went to a co-educational boarding school, and I just share some of my experiences. My environment as a boy were pretty basic. Horsehair mattresses, metal beds, no doors, no curtains. And when I went into the girls' houses, they seemed a lot more, they had curtains, and it's like they had, nice coloured paints of the walls, or, it just seemed a warmer environment. And yet, what I've heard from girls who were at my school say is that it was like the feminine side was really frowned upon. One lady mentioned to me this idea that, when her children got older, she had a teenager, she had no idea, how to help them with makeup or, styling hair, because she'd had no experience, because it was frowned upon. So, what Joy Schaverien says is it was designed for boys, but adapted for girls. So essentially it was a masculine environment, and although on the surface, my understanding from reading this and speaking to people is that on the surface it seemed like it was a bit warmer, essentially, the depth was actually the feminine aspects, sensitivity, sensuality, intimacy, those things, they were suppressed for the boys, but also for the girls as well. In certainly what Joy Schaverien talks about, she says that for many girls, intimacy, that they fill their time so that intimacy wouldn't be allowed, because they were just so busy. So touching others, just hugging, and some schools allowed that, but it was kind of frowned upon. And certainly within the boys, from my experience, I've yet to hear any boy or man share that actually intimacy was okay. The same with girls, it was kind of frowned upon, that feminine side of things. And again, although on the surface it seemed, a nicer environment, it was still pretty harsh. It was pretty cold, the environment, The food wasn't very good. So some of the issues that I've heard about is that, for men, we struggled really with our emotions. It sounds like, from what Joy Schaverien says, is obviously this idea about eating. So that's a core thing that female ex-boarders struggled with, is eating disorders. I have heard of people say, that they really struggle, and they still struggle now with eating problems. Body image is another thing. This idea that female boarding schools, what Joy Schaverien talks about, they used to wear corsets, but in schools they used to wear these wire cages. Excuse me. These wire cages, to make sure they were had the right body shapes. And this kind of brought about, certain issues if you were a different shape. So a lot of, issues arose from that. There was another difference for me reading Joy Schaverien work, is that the boys were very much seen as they went through this harsh environment, but they were entitled. So one of the things she talks about is this idea is that boys were called by their surnames, but this then linked them to their fathers, so their brothers. So it was this sense of entitlement. That was like, right, you are Lord such and such. So though they were going through a harsh environment, they were leading on to something else. Whereas the girls, their first names were used. And it's pointed out by Joy Schaverien that this was more, rather than it being kinder, it was actually patrimony. Is that it was seen that, girls were not entitled, not in the same way, because for centuries the land, the entitlements always passed to the male heir. And she talks also about these subtle forms of misogyny, which we will talk about in our interview next week. Other things, the differences between girls and boys, was that, for boys, the way that we were often kept in line were punishments, like beatings, and how the girls were controlled was through shame, and this idea that they were, if they made a mistake, then they had to kind of admit that mistake in front of the whole school. So there was this ritual shaming, rather than being beaten, they were shamed. It also sounds that the boys, certainly at the beginning, were given a bit more space, whereas the girls, it was very strict. They weren't allowed out of the houses. It was a lot more strict. Joy Schaverien talks about another thing, is this: in boarding schools there was this unconscious fear of the power of feminine sexuality, and everything was done to suppress it. And I mentioned before this thing of there was little intimacy, and how that translates in older life is marriages, is that there's also little intimacy in those marriages. So that's something that the female partners carry forward. And I would say, obviously, the male, it's similar. That, from my perspective, there was no intimacy when I was at school with other boys, because that was frowned upon. That was seen as homosexual. So the females have a similar thing there. So yeah, I'm kind of really fascinated in having this conversation with Karen and Sarah next week. And yeah, I think it's often a subject which is not talked about very much. And we're going to talk about, why is that? Why is it that we talk about boys? But Joy Schaverien book was really the first one to address, okay, what about from the female perspective? And I've heard of dozens, if not hundreds, of women who really struggled at boarding school, and people speaking up more and more about it. So it sounded like, from what Joy Schaverien is saying, is different. It was less the beatings, but more the subtle and maybe not so subtle shame that then they carry on into later life. Shame about their bodies, their sexuality, intimacy. So it's kind of a very kind of a different, it's almost sounds more complex, whereas it's quite clear for me listening, there was sexual abuse for boys, or there was beatings, right? Yes, I was beaten. Whereas things like the shaming, it's like, it feels that's much more, it's like a subtle form of control. And that's something which, okay, yeah, that's what was happening to control us, was shame. So I hope that makes sense. I'm just kind of learning about this. I went to school with girls, and I'd say another thing is that from a boys' perspective, having girls there, I put them on pedestals. I was terrified of them. So and a lot of girls in boarding schools, often until recently, it was sixth form. So these girls, and there might have been 10 girls to 100 boys. They were kind of almost worshipped, or not interacted with in a kind of a natural way. It's just, oh, it's another person. It's like, oh my God. So how must that have been for a girl to have just felt like everyone's just looking at you all the time, not really treating you as a human being? So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Any questions, please do let me know. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to having a fascinating conversation next week, and that will go live next Friday. So many blessings.